All right, we've made it to our chapter 15 wrap up. So you have all of these notes again in the What We Learned doc, and you have all of the videos and the notes in the back of your textbook you can refer to, but we'll do a final wrap up where we put everything in one place. So one of the first things we learned in chapter 15 are irregular verbs, and the irregular verbs we learned are wolo, wele, to wish or to want, and nolo, nole, to not want or to be unwilling. So these are irregular verbs. One of the themes that I think is important to keep in mind for chapters 13, 14, and 15 are that when we learn all of these pronouns or these irregular verbs, it's going to feel like you're learning a lot of new forms, but one way to cut down on the number of forms you're learning is to focus on patterns. So you'll realize that a lot seems really familiar, and there are actually only a few exceptions where you're learning something new in terms of a form or an ending. So wolo and nolo are going to have the exact same endings you would expect for your verbs, right? OST, mustis, and T. And we're just going to have some small stem changes. So again, you should be able to recognize the person and number from the ending. You'll just need to remember that there are a couple different spellings that should tip you off to the fact that you're dealing with a form of wolo or nolo. So we'll start with wolo. So you have wolo, wees, wolt. This one's a little bit tricky. And then we have wolumus, woltis, wolunt. So you can see your regular endings right there in the blue. Now for nolo, nolo is going to work almost exactly the same way that wolo does. The trick with nolo is sometimes you're going to split it up into forms of non plus wees, because it's actually just the opposite of wolo. So you'll have nolo, and then we're going to say non-wees, two separate words. And then non-wolt, two separate words again. I'm actually going to go back and change the spelling on this one so that we only keep our endings in blue. So non-wees. And then nolumus. Non-woltis, two separate words. And then finally, nolunt. So the forms that stay the same, right, are the forms that work like most of your verbs, where you're just adding an ending to a stem. Wolo, wolumus, wolunt, right? The forms that get a slightly different spelling, so wees, wolt, woltis, those are the ones that are also going to be a little weird in nolo, non-wees, non-wolt, non-woltis. So focus on the exceptions. All right, the other important thing to know about nolo is that you're going to use nolo. We're going to use the imperative of nolo to give a negative command. You've already seen some examples of this in your book. So if I want to say sit, I would say sede. If I want to say don't sit, I would say, I would use the imperative. So if I'm talking to a bunch of people, I would say nolite sedere. And I use the infinitive of my verb. Or if I'm talking to one person, this is plural, singular, I would say noli sedere. So we don't use non to negate an imperative. You use the imperative of noli or nolite plus the infinitive. All right, next up on new things we learned the irregular imperatives. So I mentioned in the video on paragraph 5 of the reading, the way to remember these are Deek, Duke, Fak, and Fair should have an E, but it isn't there. So normally for our imperatives, so if we take sede to sit, I would drop the RE from sedere, and it would just be sede in the plural, sedete. So here, if I want to say speak, dico, then I have Deek, Duco, Duke, Facio, to make or to do. It's going to be Fak, and then Pharaoh, to carry or to bear, is going to be fair. Pharaoh is also a little bit irregular in the plural, fairte. The rest of these are going to be exactly what you would expect in the plural, so we would have dicite, you all speak, to lead, ducite, and then to do, facite. So they're just missing an E. Deek, Duke, Fak, and Fair should have an E, but it isn't there. All right, and the last thing from chapter 15 are a couple of pronouns. So our first pronoun, he, kai, kak. And that is going to be translated as this or these. It can also be used as a demonstrative adjective. So pointing out these boys versus those boys, or you could just use it as a pronoun. The endings are going to be very similar to isa, id, ile, ila, ilid, etc. And in these pronouns, remember the big takeaways or the exceptions are going to be the genitive singular, which is going to end in ius, and the dative singular, which is going to end in I. And that same principle of how you decline them is going to hold true for our second pronoun, which is an intensive pronoun. That means that it just really emphasizes whatever it's talking about. You can translate it as itself, himself, or very. And it's just important not to confuse these with the reflexives. It doesn't refer back to something, but it just really, really emphasizes something. So our intensive pronoun is going to be ipse, ipsa, ipsum. So you'll use self. You could say this very person. So just emphasizes something. And this is going to work exactly the same way, same idea as isa, id, ile, ila, ilid, and this same rule about the genitive and dative singular applied to ipse as well. That's going to be something that's kind of par for the course for a lot of your pronouns. So if you want an example, you could say Flaccus ipse puerum videt. And we would translate that as Flaccus himself saw the boy.